Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hi.
Hello, could I please speak with Edwin Schlossberg?
Yes, you're speaking to Edwin Schlossberg.
Hello, this is Paul Holdengräber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes. I'm so delighted that you are able to take our call. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm alive. I'm curious. How are you living this moment of the quarantine?
I'm living on Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. Do you know where that is?
I happen to know where that is.
Yes, that's where I'm living. And I've been here for almost, 2 months, 2.5 months.
And has the pandemic struck Martha's Vineyard?
Well, there are about 15,000 people here, and there have been, I think, 13 cases.
And so what do you do with your days?
Well, I have a design company, which you may know that I am the principal of, and so I'm on the phone with them, and I'm part of and I'm calling clients and projects. So I'm zooming around a lot, and I'm also seeing my friends, and I'm doing some drawing, and I'm reading lots of books. And
what are you reading?
Well, I was just reading a book by Paul Davies, I should say, which is called The Demon in the Machine. It's really interesting about the role of consciousness in kind of the combination of how you think about consciousness occurring in thought, in the middle of thought, rather than in. What he's really interested in is that the way we think of things as using the example he looks at. He says, there's stones, and there's water, and then there's air, and then there's poetry, and then there's the area that connects the two. And so he's interested in that idea, consciousness as a thing that is the demon in the machine of our culture. It's really interesting.
How interesting! I'll have to look it up. It doesn't surprise me, Edwin, that this would interest you. Reading about your life journey, I can imagine that book was calling out to you for quite some time now.
Well, it's relatively new. It's about a year old.
Well, it's been calling out for 1 year now. You're on Martha's Vineyard, so rather protected. And this moment could, generally speaking, be affording us silence. But in some way, silence is, one would imagine it would be something that would come to us easily. But given how connected we are, and you were just mentioning Zoom, and just about everybody I talk to is in one way or another connected to Zoom. I think I read somebody saying cogito ergo Zoom. This is we're all connected. As someone who knew John Cage,
yes,
what is silence, and what happens in silence that cannot happen otherwise?
So the interesting thing is that consciousness is in silence. So the pause between words is the ones that give it the possibility of meaning. So I think John was always really interested in silence, not as if it was an interval, but silence as it was a defining tool that allowed the separation between words the moments between talking, the time you just reflecting. So the whole idea of it, that was as much a part of a composition as the making of a sound.
You know, I've always been quite attached to this one line of John Cage, which maybe you can help me unpack, where he says, "The act of listening is in fact an act of composing."
Yes, of course, because there is the illusion that that the words are sort of drifting to you, and then they go in, and then they get processed like sausage. Right. But in fact, you're actually composing everything that you hear. You're reforming it, and you're making associations all in real time. So the idea of really interesting. Sometimes composers are so interested in the delay curve. Like you strike a drum, and then you wait for the echo of it to come back, and then you hit again. And I think that the intervals are always the ones that are the most creative to compose, because the sounds are relatively easy, because you can make them.
Right. Reading about your life story is really reading the story of extraordinary encounters. And I think to some extent the extraordinary encounters are brought about by your desire to be surrounded by wise people, by people who can teach you something and from whom you might be able to learn. And one such person would be Buckminster Fuller. And I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit your encounter with him and your work on the World Game Workshop. And as you think about it now, what remains of that encounter? What are the lessons, in a way, that still linger on for you at this moment, so many years later?
Well, I met him when I was just getting out of college, and then actually sort of I was just graduated from Columbia, and I met him, and the thing that was so interesting about him was, I don't know if you feel this way, but whenever I meet someone, I feel like I can see how big they are. I don't know. I don't mean like,
No. I understand. Not how tall they are, but,
right, exactly.
how capacious they are, and,
right.
And also maybe the kind of expansiveness of their interests,
right? And
which I think is really important.
Yes, and so someone who, when I listened to him talk, when we were talking to each other, the thing that was so interesting is that he was selecting each word very purposefully in a way that you very often don't hear in people's conversation. He would, kind of, if he didn't have a word, he would kind of squeeze two words together into the word tensegrity that he made up, and Dymaxion and all kinds of. He was always squeezing words together, and then because it wasn't enough in a word to express exactly the relationships between two things. And some people do that with metaphor, but he didn't like that. I think he liked it. He was a little bit more literal in that, and so he would squeeze things together. And the idea that he almost probably the second time we met, he was talking about World Game, and he said, I think we're in a moment in time, when we're about to see the Earth not from its surface, but from the moon or from the stars, and all of a sudden thinking that human beings had never seen the Earth before, and he was thinking about that as the idea that allowed him to think about making a game where you could simulate how to optimize world resources to make it much more equitable between people. So it was amazing way he thought.
What was that game?
What was World Game?
Yeah.
But it was never, in his mind, it was let's build a map of the world the size of a football field. And then we would have sort of a big floating box over it. And then world leaders would be able to discuss how we could move resources around so that everyone would have access to all the world's resources relatively equitably. That's what his world game was.
It sounds like we need the world game now.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that in 1969 we had I went and raised some money, and we took over the studios at the studio school on 8th Street and between 5th and 6th Avenue, and we had 30 people that were kids that we got to. We wrote letters out to schools and stuff like that to say that we were going to have a world game program, and we got hundreds of people who wanted to come, and then we chose 30 people, and there was an astonishing group of people. And what we did was we built a very large map that was like 15 feet high, and about 30 feet wide, and then it was just a clear plastic sheets of it, and then we would chart where all the food was raised, where all the copper was coming from, and we got all this facts together so we could see where we would be able to optimize world resources.
I mean, it's so interesting, and I was not aware of it, and I was also not aware of your book, which I really want to read, the imaginary encounter between Einstein and Beckett.
Oh yeah.
And what did they say to each other?
Well,
I like the fact that the question elicits a laugh.
Yes. Well, every one of the things that they said to each other was drawn from quotes that they had either written or spoken. And what I orchestrated their conversation to be about was about space, time, and mass, because both of them were very interested in those three subjects. And so that's what we wrote. That's what I wrote. And I also did another book at the same time, which didn't get published, which was Imaginary Letters and Diaries of Wallace Stevens and Niels Bohr.
Goodness me. If you had to put together now two people in this kind of an imaginary dialogue or conversation, who might they be?
Wow. That's really hard.
Let's play the game.
Okay. Okay.
Who do we need now?
Well, we need someone who has the empathy and intelligence of Obama, and maybe Paul Davis, who's also quite brilliant. That's a really hard question, because in a way, the sort of larger than life minds are very different now, because because the access to information is so huge that the areas that people consider to be thoughtful are much smaller.
Well, you see, we're going back to the initial moment in our conversation, which was one about silence.
Yeah, but I think it's the interesting thing is, yes, definitely. But the interesting thing to me is, we have now somewhere between 7.6 billion people on Earth living at the same time, which is by far the largest number. And at least half of them, maybe more, just went home and stayed there. And I'm stunned by that. I am completely, utterly stunned.
Why?
Well, because it was and what drove it was the fear of a very, very powerful virus. Obviously, what drove it was fear of death, but also the willingness to be a citizen of society and do what is asked of you. And if I think that's an absolutely remarkable never before ever happened event in the history of the world, and everywhere. I mean, and not everyone, but maybe even more than 4.5 billion or 4 billion or whatever the number is. I find that astonishing, and I think, of course, that the digital communication tools have enabled that to happen with any. I think without it, no one would have dared try to get to do that. But I think that it's an amazing moment in the world, just such an amazing moment.
And would you qualify this amazing moment, never before happened, according to what you just said, as a positive outcome of technology reaching people? You would.
Yes. I mean, I think it's an amazingly difficult and especially stressful thing for people for whom the world was already narrow, that it got narrower. But I think that the idea that everyone behaved well, relatively speaking, of course, some people didn't, but the people who were behaving the worst were the leaders, not the citizens. So it's an amazing moment. Just an amazing moment.
I can feel your amazement at this moment, and that brings me to your interest in creating museums where there is a hands-on experience, and now we have this moment where teenagers and also college students, but students generally speaking, of all ages, including kindergarten students who really don't know what to do or how to stay tranquil in front of a computer and a Zoom call. And I'm wondering how maybe you don't have a first-hand experience of it, but you have some experience given your own company, how you think that form of conviviality at a distance will affect the way we take in information, learn, and the after effects of it when this pandemic does come, if not to an end, at least subside somewhat?
Well, I think that it will heighten the opportunity of collective composition and large scale. One of the things I would say as a second bounce on this idea about people being at home, that at any one time now in the world, there are several billion people playing massive multiplayer games, sometimes 3 and 4 billion people playing massive multiplayer games where they're playing with lots of other people. And I think that that's also a completely unconscious, in most people's heads, reality, not for the gamers, but for all the people who are not gamers. They don't realize that so many people are spending 8 hours a day in a simulated world and playing games with one another. And we have that for the last, 5 years, as this massive multiplayer games phenomena has arisen as being gigantic. It's been constantly surprising to me that most of the people that I come in contact with have no clue that that's actually going on, and it's the by far the biggest entertainment business on earth, and so many other things. And I think that these kinds of collaborative, collective activities, some less physical than others, clearly, physical contact, are going to be the mainstay of consciousness, because the challenges of the earth are become so much more interesting and so much more better solved when lots of people are able to solve them collaboratively. So I think that's the thing to learn.
But do people need to be in contact with each other the way you perceived it earlier in your career, where there's a real hands-on experience, there's a communal effect where you're in a room, not simulating contact. And I think particularly of your interest, which I share very deeply, for Irving Goffman. And I remember in the presentation of Self in Everyday Life, he speaks about this notion of staged authenticity and perhaps the dangers of staged authenticity.
Yes, I think that all these things have, as with everything in life, beautiful, hideous, gorgeous, amazing, all the different qualities. But I think that the challenges of the most interesting thing in the world is the consciousness of people and what they see, hear, and do from the perspective that they have composed. And so those stories and what they bring to a problem, or what they bring to a solution, is just astonishing. And so the more that we get collaborative input and collective input, the more we can solve these problems. I mean, there have been really good stories about a couple of companies that have focused on pandemics and their ability and how they tracked the virus itself and couldn't get anybody's attention as they saw it moving around the world. So I think that all these tools that are much more metaphysical than physical are going to be very important, but the physical things become the kind of the very special opportunities of like nodes of excellence, where people get together to pool what they understand and what they think is important about a specific subject.
I remember once being in a dialogue with a man called Stuart Brown,
Stuart Brown?
Yeah, Stuart Brown, who created the National Institute for Play, and he believed very strongly, and had actually data about it, that the rough and tumble play of children actually prevents violent behavior, and that so many really, really dangerous criminals, one might say, early on, one fact of their life that was similar for all of them is that they hadn't learned how to really play.
Right.
And so this virtual reality we're now confronted with, all the more so with this pandemic, might have aftershocks which we can't even quite measure.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that there will be such sort of excitement about going to see lots of other people and being able to test. We all go out and see other people, and then we have, so we have something to tell each one of them, or hopefully that they find interesting or funny or whatever. And that's one of the things that is not as satisfying when you do it as serially as if you do it simultaneously. So that's an important. That's why I think that these last couple of months are going to be a huge moment in the history of the world, because of the fact that people were separated out and then had to think about all the things that they were doing, and that there were still at the same time at least half the people who were separated out were actually playing games together in the millions.
How do you think they might come back? In other words, how? It's a question I've been asking over the last 6 weeks that this series has been on the air, is this notion of returning to normal life.
I think it just requires vaccine. I think without that, it will be awkward for a really long time.
I wonder, though, if we want to go back to normal life, or if this.
No, I don't think there is normal life. I think that's I think it's always been changing. The 200,000 people more there's 200,000 more people alive are born every day in the world. So there's gigantics. This is a huge, humans are now the largest species on Earth. And so these things are now, these are all adventures we're going to be going through. We passed 8 billion people soon.
I was asking you what imaginary conversation you might want to write about or host, as it were, and that really brings about your interest in the intersection between science and art, and the dangers also when there isn't really an intersection. And I'm really taken by one comment that Robert Rauschenberg made to you, where he said there have to be more interesting ways to grow than older. And in closing, I'd love you to comment on that sentence. What it might mean for you now.
Well, I just think
when you look back,
I think that he and many of these people that I was so lucky to meet with and be friendly with and work with, and the thing about them was that every day felt like an opportunity. That it wasn't as if Bob thought that he had to forget everything.
Right.
It was just that it isn't the it isn't the length of time you do something or how long you do it for or anything like that. It's growing in perspective, growing in your ability to confront things that you always were afraid of, and growing able to be nicer to people or nicer to yourself, growing, all those things that you can grow. And so I think that was what he was such a surprising person, always to talk with him.
It must have been extraordinary. A quotation I'll end this program with of John Cage, which seems to me so important and kind of a lifelong journey to embark on. He said, to use art not as self-expression, but as self-alteration.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's not just to say, what do I think, but how does it actually change me and change my course, as it were.
Yeah, I think that one of the threads of human life has always been this idea of we have to remember things so that we can teach everyone how, so that they can take care of themselves, so that the skills aren't lost. Diderot's encyclopedia. When during the revolution, he made the encyclopedia because he was afraid that people would kill each other and no one would know how to make things anymore. I think I mentioned that to my son, and he said, well, the internet's here. You don't have to worry about that because we've got so much of it stored here. And that's both terrifying to me and incredibly it's optimistic that we can't lose, in other words, the best painting, the best book, the best. There'll be thousands of them and thousands of places to push off from. In a world of 8 or 9 billion people, you need to be thinking about that. And the cultures can be so regenerative because they have so many different points of view that they can start from. And I think that's sort of also what Bob Rauschenberg was talking about.
Edwin, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and I hope someday we have the pleasure actually of not meeting on a Zoom call, but in person.
Great, I would love that.
I would love that very much as well. And thank you very, very much for taking the time, and stay well, stay safe, and until
you
next
too.
time. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, Go to dublab.com/support.